A British bayonet glints in the dawn light over an empty trench in Brooklyn. 9,000 American soldiers are gone without a trace. The entire Continental Army sits trapped against the churning black water of the East River. General George Washington stares at the far bank through a thick, suffocating shroud of fog. One more hour of daylight, and the British will slaughter the last of the rebellion. The American Revolution is hours away from total, permanent collapse. On August 22, 1776, the British fleet anchored off Gravesend Bay. General William Howe disembarked 20,000 battle-hardened regulars onto Long Island. Red-coated infantry filled the horizon, stretching past the woods and the rolling hills. The American defense crumbled under the weight of superior British numbers and discipline. By August 27th, the Continental forces were pushed back to the fortifications at Brooklyn Heights. The British had outflanked the American lines during the Battle of Long Island. Chaos consumed the retreating ranks of the inexperienced colonial troops. Panic spread through the militia as the British Iron Ring tightened around their position. Brigadier General William Alexander, known as Lord Stirling, held the line at the Old Stone House. His Maryland and Delaware regiments stood firm against the advancing British columns near Gowanus Creek. They launched a desperate, suicidal charge to buy time for the rest of the army. 400 men stepped into the fire of the British musketry. Fewer than 10 of those soldiers returned to the main American fortifications. The survivors huddled behind the earthworks of Brooklyn Heights as night fell. They faced a lethal blockade of British warships in the harbor. General Howe's men dug in just yards away, preparing for a final, decisive assault. The American army sat pinned against the river, waiting for the end. The entire future of the rebellion rested on a narrow, treacherous stretch of water. Rain lashed the exposed earthworks of Brooklyn Heights on August 28, 1776. Mud turned the trenches into a sodden, impassable mire. General William Howe ordered his men to halt their advance toward the American lines. The British soldiers huddled under heavy wool coats, shivering as the storm intensified. General George Washington watched the gray horizon from the edge of his command post. His army of 9,000 men stood trapped between the enemy and the churning East River. Water levels rose rapidly in the nearby creek, flooding the low-lying fields. The storm effectively paralyzed the British artillery batteries. Washington paced the muddy perimeter of the camp, surveying his exhausted troops. His men lacked food, dry powder, and any clear path of retreat. The British fleet anchored in the harbor threatened to cut off the river at any moment. Every hour of rain bought the Continental Army a desperate chance to survive. Washington convened his senior officers inside a cramped, makeshift tent. He proposed an impossible maneuver under the cover of the following night. The plan required the silent extraction of every soldier, cannon, and supply crate. They needed to cross the wide, treacherous current of the East River to Manhattan. British scouts lingered just yards away, listening for any sign of movement. The fate of the American rebellion rested on the secrecy of the planned withdrawal. Washington finalized the orders while the wind howled against the canvas walls. The army prepared to vanish before the British could resume their final assault. Would a single leak in the plan expose the entire force to certain death? The dark waters of the East River churned against the wooden docks. Colonel John Glover stood among his men in the damp night air. He commanded the 14th Continental Regiment of the Continental Army. His soldiers hailed from the fishing port of Marblehead, Massachusetts. They spent their lives navigating the treacherous currents of the North Atlantic. The men possessed the specific maritime skills required for this impossible task. Glover ordered his regiment to secure every flat-bottomed boat and sailboat. They scouted the nearby creeks for any vessel capable of carrying troops. The soldiers moved through the shadows with practiced, silent efficiency. Each man knew how to handle a tiller and rig a sail in the dark. They gathered a fleet of small, fragile craft along the riverbank. The current of the East River flowed fast and unpredictable toward the harbor. Glover's men rowed with muffled oars to avoid detection by the British fleet. They ferried 9,000 soldiers across the water in complete silence. Heavy artillery pieces were loaded onto the flat-bottomed boats with extreme care. Crates of ammunition and essential supplies occupied every inch of available space. The men worked through the night under the shroud of darkness. Not a single lantern burned on the water during the delicate crossings. The Marblehead men navigated the tide using only the stars and their instincts. They completed trip after trip between the Brooklyn shore and Manhattan. The survival of the entire Continental Army rested on these small wooden hulls. Washington watched from the dock as his force slowly disappeared into the night. The river air remained cold and thick with the scent of salt and mud. The 14th Continental Regiment maintained a steady, rhythmic pace until dawn. Every soldier, cannon, and horse reached the safety of the Manhattan side. The logistical expertise of the fishermen prevented a total tactical disaster. The army escaped the trap before General Howe realized the trenches were empty. Darkness descended upon the trenches of Brooklyn Heights on the night of August 29, 1776. George Washington ordered a skeleton force to remain behind in the forward positions. These men maintained the illusion of a fully manned defensive line. They kept small campfires burning along the perimeter of the fortifications. The flickering light cast long, shifting shadows against the cold, damp earth. British scouts peered through the gloom from their nearby encampments. They heard the rhythmic sound of digging and the occasional shout of a sentry. The noise convinced the British patrols that the Continental Army remained in place. General William Howe prepared his men for a decisive morning assault. He expected to find the American army trapped against the East River at dawn. Behind the lines, the main body of the Continental Army moved with silent precision. Columns of soldiers filed toward the riverbank under the cover of total darkness. They stepped carefully over the mud to minimize the sound of their boots. Each regiment carried its own muskets, ammunition, and heavy equipment. The men moved in absolute silence to avoid alerting the nearby British sentries. Washington stood near the waterfront to oversee the final stages of the withdrawal. He watched his exhausted troops board the small, flat-bottomed vessels. The soldiers huddled together in the damp hulls of the boats. The Marblehead men gripped their oars with steady, experienced hands. Every movement across the water relied on the expertise of the 14th Continental Regiment. The soldiers in the trenches continued to feed the fires until the final moment. They maintained the deception as the last remnants of the army reached the docks. The British military remained unaware of the mass evacuation taking place just yards away. The survival of the revolution rested on this fragile, silent performance. The sun remained below the horizon on the morning of August 30th, 1776. A heavy gray mist rolled off the surface of the East River. This dense fog blanketed the Brooklyn shoreline in a thick, opaque veil. The natural phenomenon obscured the final movements of the Continental Army. Meteorological conditions near the river frequently produced such heavy morning vapors. The moisture clung to the wooden hulls of the remaining flat-bottomed boats. George Washington moved through the damp, silent trenches one final time. He inspected the abandoned fortifications for any signs of left-behind equipment. The commander-in-chief boarded the last vessel bound for the Manhattan side. The Marblehead men hauled on their oars with strained, steady rhythm. The fog acted as a physical screen against the watchful British patrols. General William Howe's forces remained stationed just yards from the empty works. The British sentries peered into the white void but saw nothing. The sound of the oars remained muffled by the heavy, humid air. The boats crossed the treacherous, swirling currents of the tidal river. Not a single British cannon fired toward the retreating American craft. Washington reached the Manhattan docks at approximately 7 a.m. His arrival marked the successful completion of the desperate overnight withdrawal. The entire force of 9,000 men had safely crossed the water. Every artillery piece, horse, and supply crate reached the island intact. The fog began to lift as the morning heat touched the river. The British Army finally pushed forward to claim the abandoned Brooklyn lines. General William Howe found only empty trenches and discarded supplies. The American Revolution survived the narrowest of escapes from total annihilation. The morning sun climbed higher over the East River. The heavy gray mist finally dissipated into the warming air. General William Howe stepped onto the abandoned Brooklyn Heights fortifications. His soldiers moved through the silent, empty trenches with muskets raised. They expected to encounter the final ranks of a desperate enemy. Instead, they found only cold campfires and discarded equipment. The British commanders searched every dugout and bunker for a sign of the retreating force. The Continental Army had vanished without a single engagement. General Howe reported the total loss of the American force from his grasp. His tactical victory at the Battle of Long Island had failed to secure the war. The survival of George Washington and his 9,000 soldiers changed the conflict forever. The American Revolution lived to fight another day on Manhattan soil. Historians later recognized the operation as a masterclass in military necessity. The success relied on the specialized skills of the Marblehead men. Nature provided the screen, but human discipline ensured the army reached the far shore. The revolution did not collapse in the mud of Brooklyn. It retreated into the shadows to continue a long, grinding struggle for independence. The trap you thought was safely buried in the history books is not as static as it seems. You stand on the edge of your own sudden, silent withdrawals, waiting for the fog to lift on a choice you cannot undo. The tide is turning, and you are already in the boat.